He started to wonder late in the 1950s whether sugar might be a culprit in the increase in heart disease.
More significant than fat, which was the prevailing opinion at the time.
Certainly more significant than fat, certainly more significant than fat, but that sugar was also involved in a number of other undesirable conditions, particularly diabetes and obesity.
That thesis soon put Yudkin in direct conflict with Big Sugar's biggest apologist, this man, American nutritionist Ancel Keys. Keys would later be exposed as having been funded by the industry, but not before he helped destroy John Yudkin's reputation.
And as early as the 1950s, he had started producing publications suggesting that dietary fat was a problem.
Award-winning science writer and author, Gary Taubes.
Keys successfully managed to detain Yudkin with this smell of quackery, and from then on in, anyone else for the next 20, 30 years who did research on sugar was accused of being just like Yudkin.
There was a systematic campaign to discredit or ignore his work.
Because of the actions of the sugar industry in the 70s, virtually no research was funded. You know, this idea that if you study sugar, you're just like Yudkin and he was a quack.
But that's remarkable. I mean, what you're saying, scientific investigation into the link between sugar and disease ground to a halt?
It ground to a halt.
When we return, the science is back. What happens when you take healthy students and feed them too much sugar? It's week 1 of the Fifth Estate Sugar Challenge.
Just looking at recipes that actually help reduce the sugar in your diets.
And the Breedens are getting a cooking lesson. Chef James Smith is teaching that real food, all the fruits and vegetables and grains of a healthy diet, can also be fast and delicious without any added sugar at all.
They use specific ingredients that will change up and lower the sugar and lower the processed foods in your diet.
And that may prove a good thing, because after decades of silence, there's new scientific research linking sugar to all kinds of chronic disease. Jonathan's blood work suggests he may be on the verge of getting one. Dr. Dan Flanders.
His results suggest that he's pre-diabetic, that his levels have been high, and that if we don't make some changes to his lifestyle soon, diabetes is coming.
Today in North America, it's estimated more than 100 million people are diabetic or pre-diabetic. Dr. Robert Lustig is quite sure he knows why.
So I can actually categorically say to you that sugar is the proximate cause of diabetes worldwide. And we have hard and fast data to show that.
His data come from his own study, done over a decade, comparing diabetes rates in 175 countries with people's diets.
And we ask the question, when you adjust for all of the factors that we know are relevant, what about the food supply predicts diabetes rates worldwide? Answer, sugar, and only sugar.
These studies are generally considered a very weak level of evidence. A lot of other things have happened at the same time.
Toronto researcher Dr. John Sievenpiper. He argues Lustig's methodology is seriously flawed.
Methodologists would tell you there's a lot of potential bias. And I could give you one example. Over the same time as sugar has gone up, so has bottled water. But there's no real biological plausibility in the link between bottled water and overweight and obesity. So it's not, I don't think, a sound finding. But we have to be careful in putting too much of the biological plausibility and wanting to believe patterns that we see.
His point is it's hard to know what causes disease, and ethically you can't induce it to find out. But you can test for markers, warning signs that disease may be coming. And that's what they're doing here at the University of California at Davis. this lab, students are the guinea pigs. The scientists are feeding them sugar to figure out if it raises the markers for heart disease. That drink contained 25% of her daily calories as high fructose corn syrup.
Oh, look at this.
Every time they've run the test, says Dr. Kimber Stanhope, the results have been the same.
We saw increases in visceral adiposity. That means that's the fat within the abdominal region. This is the fat surrounding the liver and the intestines and the kidney. This is the fat that is associated with increased risk for diabetes and cardiovascular disease.
The Bredens know that fat. Anna and Jonathan have already been diagnosed as having fatty livers, which puts them at risk for raised insulin and triglyceride levels. That's the fat in our blood. When Dr. Stanhope tested the blood of her college guinea pigs, healthy kids with healthy livers, she was shocked by how quickly they saw problems.
We definitely, in 2 weeks, see increases in the risk factors for cardiovascular disease in the blood.
Just in 2 weeks?
In 2 weeks.
But those kinds of studies don't impress everyone. After surveying a number of studies, including Dr. Stanhope's, that look at sugar and heart disease, John Siebenpiper sees no reason for alarm.
And what we find when we look at those trials very carefully is that as long as you match for calories, fructose does not behave differently than does any other form of carbohydrate, namely starches, refined starches, and glucose. Now, that's not to say that they're benign, because I don't think we should be having a lot of refined starch or glucose, but it's not behaving any differently.
Stanhope can't speak to the other studies, but she says she tested for all kinds of things, and it was only the fructose that caused the problems.
If I had results as strong with regard to a food additive, a brand new food additive, and then I started producing these results, that additive would get pulled pretty quickly.
That's how strong these results are?
I think they are.
In the world of cancer research, Lewis Cantley is a rock star. 5 years ago, the Cornell University professor was chosen to head a scientific dream team, a group of America's top cancer specialists brought together to supercharge the search for a cure. His findings may not be embraced by everyone, but in the cancer world, when Cantley talks, people listen. Let me ask then, do you believe that sugar consumption causes cancer?
Yes, I think that eating too much sugar can definitely increase the probability of cancer and also make the outcome of people who already have cancer worse.
So how? Well, let's review what sugar's made of. 1 molecule glucose and 1 fructose. We know that when there's too much fructose in the liver, it sets off a chain reaction. The pancreas produces more insulin. What Cantley now believes is that excess insulin changes cancer tumors, telling them to gobble up the glucose.
What we're now learning is that some of the cancers, particularly those cancers that correlate with obesity and diabetes, often have insulin receptor on the cancer cell. The tumor, by expressing the insulin receptor, tricks the glucose into going into the tumor rather than the muscle and fat. And as a consequence, the tumor can use that glucose as a fuel to grow.
So if sugar can fuel existing tumors and make them grow, can it also cause tumors to form in the first place? The science on that isn't as clear yet, but Cantley's taking no chances.
It scares me, yes. I think if definitely, for example, I don't, I'll eat fruit. Fruit has sugar in it, obviously. But if I can avoid any sugar at all in any drinks that I drink or foods, I try to avoid processed foods because it's hard to find one that doesn't have sugar in it. I certainly avoid sugar when I can.
One of the criticisms of the anti-sugar scientists is that too much of their evidence comes from animals, not humans. That said, here at Brown University in Rhode Island, they're doing studies they think should make a lot of humans nervous. This rat is perfectly healthy. Put him in a vat of water and he finds his way to safety every time.
5.2.
Now, look at this guy. What he's been eating is the equivalent of a North American diet, complete with all the fats and sugars we regularly consume. He doesn't know where to go. His brain has been damaged.
These rats were totally normal, and then they turned into demented animals. They don't remember their learning after even a day. And as the challenge gets harder and harder, they fail more and more, just like a human with Alzheimer's disease.
36.2.
In this lab, the belief now is that Alzheimer's is really diabetes of the brain, linked to insulin levels, which can be affected by too much sugar. Professor Suzanne Delamonte.
Insulin resistance, we now know, can occur in any organ. It can occur in the muscles, that's what diabetes is. It can occur in the liver, that causes fatty liver disease. It can occur in the ovaries, that's polycystic ovary disease. And it can occur in the brain, and we think that's Alzheimer's.
Now, it's important to remember that none of this research represents the scientific mainstream. The case against sugar has not been proven. Associations on both sides of the border for Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes, including Health Canada and the FDA, they all know about this research, and yet none of them is warning about links between sugar and disease. But there is one important group that is raising the alarm. The American Heart Association now recommends that people cut back on added sugar dramatically. Women should have no more than 6 teaspoons a day, men 9. Don't forget the total sugar intake in this country per person is 26 teaspoons a day. And yet, the Canadian food industry remains unimpressed. We've talked to people who are quite convinced that there is a relationship, a correlation between sugar and diabetes and heart disease, cancer, dementia. What happens if those people are right?
At this point in time, I'm comfortable saying that the science just isn't there to support a role in chronic disease.
When we come back, government goes on the attack.
If your kids drink 1 bottle of soda a day, they're eating the equivalent of 50 pounds of sugar a year. The equivalent of 50 pounds of sugar from just 1 soda a day.
And Big Sugar strikes back.
Everywhere you turn, somebody is telling us what we can't eat.
Worldwide, there are few industries more powerful than the processed food industry, or the sugar industry that feeds it. And yet, for all their power, we know remarkably little about how they work. Kristen Cousins is determined to change that. As a community care dentist in Colorado, she'd always been interested in sugar. But it wasn't until she unearthed a stash of documents from a sugar company that had gone out of business that she got a peek into a very secretive world.
The first folder that I pulled out opened up to a memo, the blue letterhead of the Sugar Association, and it had the word confidential underneath the letterhead. And I just looked at that and oh my God, you know, what have I found?
What she'd found was a directive from the 70s, a memo to industry executives about a newly published scientific white paper, a paper that concluded sugar was not only safe, but important.
It was clear after reading further that the Sugar Association had funded this white paper called Sugar in the Diet of Man, and they were trying to make it appear that it was an independent study.
Among the more than 1,500 pages she uncovered, there were some Canadian ones too. An account of a sugar industry meeting in the 70s in Montreal that included frank talk about heart disease.
The greatest threat to sugar consumption is in the field of nutrition. It says, more particularly in view of comments that have been recently made on the influence of sugar in atherosclerosis. So they were worried.
They were worried as far back as 1971.
What does that say to you?
They've known for a long time. So I took this paper and crossed out where it said tobacco and put in sugar and looked to see if I could find similar tactics that the sugar industry was using.
Today, Cousins is pursuing her research at the University of California in San Francisco. And she's doing it under the tutelage of someone to whom it all sounds familiar.
The amazing thing I learned from her was that strategies that I thought the tobacco companies made up back in the 50s, actually some of those the sugar people had done even before that. Well, you know, now we have 83 million pages of industry documents that's on the internet. We don't bother.
Stan Glantz is famous in litigation circles as a man who first publicized secret tobacco industry documents that prove cigarette companies knew their product was dangerous. In the new sugar documents, he sees lots of parallels.
Well, one parallel is just trying to undermine science. Another one is working to try to attack and intimidate scientists and others who are coming up with results that these big corporate interests don't like. Another one is trying to subvert sensible regulation.
The sugar industry has decades of practice in that. In 2003, the World Health Organization in Geneva was looking at a resolution recommending people reduce their sugar intake to just 10% of what they eat. It had broad appeal among health experts, but then the industry weighed in.
The sugar industry went to their friends in the U.S. Congress, and they got these very influential congressmen to write a letter and say that this is simply unacceptable, and in fact that the U.S. would pull its funding for the World Health Organization if this report continued.